Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 375. And this time I'm going to talk about this record, which came out on Blue Note in 1968 by Duke Pearson, The Phantom. What I have here is a 2020 reissue, remastered by Kevin Gray, part of the Tone Poets series. While I personally haven't had a bunch of Belgian engineers wearing vintage Chinese military headphones check out the acoustics in a dedicated carbon fiber basement suite, the sound is pretty good to my ears. There is a little bit of boominess to the bass, probably an original flaw that Kevin Gray couldn't do much about. But there were bigger problems to worry about in this world, like, for instance, the erosion of the post-war democratic consensus, and the music on here is actually really good. Duke Pearson was not only a great hard bop piano player, he was also important as a composer, as a band leader, as an arranger. His own recording career was not particularly long. It lasts from the late 1950s until illness curtails his activities in the mid-70s, but it contains a number of excellent works under his own name, from small groups to big bands. And he also contributes in quieter ways to a lot of other great records by other musicians. He flew under the radar. He's these days probably thought of more as a sideman, if he's thought of at all. He doesn't even have an entry in my copy of the Penguin Guide to Jazz, but then again, those are the guys who gave Donald Byrd's magnificent record A New Perspective, which is largely a Duke Pearson creation, 2 stars, calling it dispensable. Over the course of his career, Pearson's music always moved with the times, but it was always straightforward and it was always accessible. And this record from 1968 reflects a couple of his abiding interests: Latin music and Brazilian music. Duke Pearson was born Columbus Calvin Pearson Jr. in August 1932 in Atlanta. Duke is a nickname given to him by an uncle who was a big fan of Ellington. He began on the piano as a little boy, but he abandons it around age 12 in favor of the trumpet, which he plays for about the next 10 years, including all the way through his time in the music program at Clark College in Atlanta. In 1953, he was drafted into the U.S. Army, fortunately for him, after the end of the Korean War. He spends a little under 2 years there playing trumpet in Army bands, but he was having problems with his teeth, which were interfering with his ability on the instrument. At the same time, he'd also made friends with a number of other musical draftees, including Louis Smith and the piano players Phineas Newborn and Wynton Kelly. And it's Wyn Kelly's playing, which Pearson found just fantastic, which convinces him, combined with his issues playing the trumpet, to return to his first instrument, the piano. He was discharged in 1954, and the next 5 years are kind of his jazz apprenticeship on piano. He plays in relative obscurity in Georgia and the northern parts of Florida. And while I can find no explicit reference to this, I think it's pretty likely that during this era he crossed paths with the Adderley brothers. Cannonball and his brother Nat were from Tampa, but they'd grown up in Tallahassee, which is just about 30 miles from the Florida-Georgia state line. And years before he ever set foot in New York or in a serious recording studio, Duke Pearson has a song of his recorded by Cannonball in 1957. It's his tribute to the late Clifford Brown on Cannonball's record Sophisticated Swing. That same track is covered a year later by his Army buddy Louis Smith on a Blue Note release. Smith had played it with Pearson while he was in Pearson's group in Atlanta. And 2 other Pearson songs appear on Nat Adderley's release Much Brass from March 1959. Emboldened and probably modestly enriched by these developments, Pearson makes the decision to move to New York, which he does in January 1959. He works in a religious bookstore while he's waiting for his union card to arrive, and when it does, he rapidly gets work as a performer and a composer and an arranger. He soon begins to play with the trumpeter Donald Byrd, and his first performance credit occurs on October 4th, 1959, on Byrd's record Fuego, which comes out the following year. Pearson's first record as a leader, Profile, is made for Blue Note that very same month on the 25th, and that's a trio effort with Gene Taylor on bass and Donald Byrd's drummer Lex Humphreys. And Pearson's follow-up for Blue Note is actually recorded before the first one had even been released, in a December 1959 session which produces the LP Tender Feelin's. In those early days in New York, Duke Pearson had really clicked with Donald Byrd, and he appears at a whole bunch of Donald Byrd recordings over the next few years, including those great live recordings at the Half Note Cafe, which feature Pearson's best-known composition, Janine. In the spring of 1960, he joins a fairly high-profile group in New York, the Jazz Tet, led by Benny Golson and Art Farmer, replacing McCoy Tyner, who'd gone off to join Coltrane. But he still continues to work with Donald Byrd, and later on in 1960, he joins the quintet, which Byrd and Pepper Adams had formed. In the midst of all this, Pearson also finds the time to work in the backup band of the singer Nancy Wilson, and he goes with her to Brazil in 1961, where his exposure to bossa nova had a profound impact on him, and it shows up actually later on this record. If it's not clear already, Pearson was in high demand pretty much from the moment he set foot in New York. He was a triple threat. He could play a mean blues-tinged piano like Horace Silver, he could write, he could arrange. He was, at the same time, however, not somebody who naturally sought the spotlight. He made his best contributions in a collective setting, and all of these attributes put together made him absolute gold in the studio. Earlier in this video, I'd mentioned this record, Donald Byrd's album from 1963 or 4, A New Perspective, which is really kind of a unique record. It's got some very interesting, exciting vocal arrangements. It's got a couple of great compositions by Duke Pearson, including Cristo Redentor, which is just an amazing track. And although Byrd's the leader, it's really hard to imagine this record without Pearson's guiding hand. In making that record, he had hugely impressed the Blue Note boss, Alfred Lion. And when Lion's A&R guy at Quebec died just a few days later, after A New Perspective was made, he reached out to Pearson and offered him the job. Pearson accepts, and he becomes hugely influential at Blue Note throughout the rest of the 1960s. The mixture of hard bop and soul jazz, which you see in the Blue Note catalog at this time, is very much the result of Pearson's imprint as Lion's influence waned, and his fingerprints are all over some great records like Joe Henderson's Inner Urge, Grant Green's Idle Moments, for which Pearson wrote the title track, and Blue Mitchell's Boss Horn. He did lots of arranging for Mitchell, for Lee Morgan, for Stanley Turrentine, other Blue Note stars, and after Lion steps away from the label in 1967, Pearson assumes more production duties, although I think it's probably safe to assume that he was doing an awful lot of production before Lion stepped away, but just wasn't getting the credit. It's only from 1968 on that you consistently see him listed as producer. So Pearson is super busy for Blue Note throughout the 1960s, but he's also a working musician all through this time. He's leading his own groups, big and small, in a variety of musical styles, and it's a session in the late summer of 1968, which includes a Latin percussion section, which produces this record. This record is largely made on the afternoon of September 11, 1968, at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs. There had been an earlier unsuccessful attempt to make this record some months earlier on June 24th, from which only one track survives on here, Bunda Amarela. The producer nominally is Frank Wolf, but I assume that in reality it was probably Pearson, and his role here is very much conceptual. His piano does feature here and there, but it's nothing like a dominant feature of the record. The music is made by an octet featuring a solid Latin percussion section, and the melodies are largely carried by either flute or vibes. Jerry Dojan plays the flute and the alto flute. Bobby Hutchison plays the vibes. There are two guitar players, Sam Brown on acoustic and Al Gaffa on electric. Longtime Blue Note session guys Bob Cranshaw and Mickey Roker are on bass and drums respectively. Victor Pantoja is on congas, and he's joined in the percussion section by Patato Valdez. Side 1 starts with the centerpiece of the record, the title track, The Phantom, which is about 10 minutes long. It's built around a 3-chord ostinato. I would note that I mentioned there was a certain boominess to the bass. This is the track where it's most obvious. Pearson does feature on piano here, but my favorite contributions are actually those of the vibes and the flute. Blues for Elvina is a happy little tune featuring Dojan's flute and the Latin percussion section. Bunda Amarela, which was the lone track which survived from June, is the first track that has a genuinely Latin beat to it. It features Dojan's flute again and Hutchison's vibes. Side 2 begins with Los Ojos Alegres, which is a bossa number, a very nice one actually, which owes, I would respectfully suggest, a bit of a musical debt or a melodic debt to Tom Jobim, in particular his track Agua de Beber. The next track is Say You're Mine. It's guitar and flute led, it's in 6/8 time, and it's just delicious. And the record concludes with Moana Surf, which is a Jerry Dojan composition, and I think the best track on the record. It has a gentle intro which eventually develops into kind of a galloping beat, and it has this interplay between flute and vibes, which actually characterizes a lot of this record, gives it a very airy feel. Anyway, very nice track. When you're picking up what I would call late-stage Blue Note records after Alfred Lion exits stage left, it pays to be a little bit choosy. But on the other hand, Duke Pearson's involvement usually means that what you're getting is quality, and that's what you're getting here. Bringing post-bop, bossa nova, and Latin music all under one roof is a fairly ambitious goal, and not all of the experiments on here are equally well realized, I would say. However, at its best, this record manages to fuse these three different traditions, producing a lighthearted jazz record which resists being too pop-oriented or certainly in any way schlocky. In terms of sound quality, I'm uncertain that the Kevin Gray version that I have here is a must, but I welcome comments from those who differ. But whatever version or format of this record you find, there is much here to appreciate. And for me, it's 4 to 5 stars.